The house on Balcombe Lane had not seen visitors in months, a once proud Georgian manor. Its high windows now squinted against overgrown ivy, and the wind whistled mournfully through its ill-fitted eaves. Inside, silence reigned until the maid, a pale creature named Elsie, pushed open the library door and screamed. Sir Gregory Lanchester was slumped in the wing-backed chair beside the fireplace, a half-burnt manuscript drooping from one hand, the other outstretched toward a toppled decanter of brandy. His eyes stared at nothing, and a thin trickle of blood marked the corner of his mouth. But it was not the body that would later confound the authorities, it was the whistling. Somewhere in the house, a faint, tuneless whistle rose and fell, weaving through the corridors like a ghost in search of form. Elsie swore it had been there, even before she found the body, drifting from room to room with no source, no origin. The police arrived within the hour. Inspector Moffat, a square-jawed man with the patience of a judge and the imagination of a turnip, surveyed the scene with customary gruffness. No signs of forced entry. All doors locked from the inside. No footprints in the garden's muddy walkways. The windows were latched, and the key to the library had been in Sir Gregory's own waistcoat pocket. The coroner could not agree on a cause of death. No wounds, no poison in the glass. The trickle of blood, possibly from a burst vessel. But the expression on Sir Gregory's face caught halfway between terror and disbelief hinted at something more sinister. And then there was the portrait, above the fireplace, framed in gold leaf and layers of grime, hung a painting most of the staff had forgotten existed. It showed a woman in Edwardian dress, seated stiffly, her face turned slightly to one side as if distracted by something just out of view. Her lips were parted not in a smile, but in what some swore looked like the start of a whistle. Her name, written on the frame's plaque, had long since faded. Elsie, when questioned again, said she'd noticed something peculiar earlier that morning. The portrait had been quiet the day before, as it always was, but when she came to clean the room, she heard a sound that seemed to come from the painting itself, a high, soft whistle. She thought it a trick of the wind. Moffat scoffed. "Paintings don't whistle, neither do corpses," she replied. And yet, that was when Lord Peter Wimsey arrived, fresh from a quiet retreat in Sussex, and finding himself unreasonably bored by convalescence. Wimsey was drawn by the oddity of the case, a man dead for no clear reason, in a locked room, under the gaze of a whistling portrait. Bunter, his faithful valet, trailed behind him with an umbrella and a case of monogrammed cufflinks that Wimsey had insisted upon, in case appearances must be preserved while investigating the macabre. "I say," Wimsey drawled, crouching beside the armchair. "He looks as though he saw the devil peering from the wallpaper." Inspector Moffat frowned. "I'd prefer something a bit more factual." "Quite," Wimsey said lightly, rising and turning to the portrait. "But in these matters, dear Moffat, the facts often hide in plain sight behind the fanciful. If you will, tell me, did anyone hear this so-called whistling after the body was found?" Moffat hesitated. "The maid insists it continued for a few minutes after she raised the alarm, but the constables heard nothing by the time they arrived." Wimsey clasped his hands behind his back and paced the room. "And the manuscript in his hand?" "Half-finished autobiography," said Moffat. "The last page ends mid-sentence. The portrait has begun to, and that's all." Wimsey's eyebrows lifted. "Begun to? What whistle? Speak." "Blink." He walked to the fireplace and studied the frame. "Have it taken down," he instructed. "I should like to examine it closely." Behind the portrait was nothing unusual, a hook, a nail, plaster wall. But on the back of the canvas itself was something curious, a patch stitched in a different thread, holding together what looked like a tear. Bunter fetched a small light and magnifying lens from his bag, and together they examined the patch. "The fabric's newer than the rest," Bunter observed, "and poorly done. Someone wasn't trying to preserve the portrait, they were hiding something." Wimsey took a penknife and, with delicate precision, unpicked the stitches. Inside, folded tightly, was a yellowed sheet of music. No title, just a strange sequence of notes with annotations in Latin. "A musical cipher," Wimsey muttered, intrigued, "and one with a message, if I'm not mistaken. But what would our poor Gregory want with a coded tune hidden behind his auntie's portrait?" Further examination yielded a more sinister detail behind the paneling near the fireplace. A small mechanical device, now deactivated. It consisted of a series of pipes, a clockwork timer, and a reed similar to that found in a flute or whistle. "A mechanical whistler," said Whimsy with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Controlled by timer or remote trigger, designed to emit an eerie tune at will." "But why?" asked Moffat. "To frighten," Whimsy said. "To torment, or perhaps to kill. The cause of death," Whimsy suspected, was not poison or weapon, but fear itself. Sir Gregory had suffered from a congenital heart defect, a fact confirmed by his physician. He'd also grown increasingly paranoid in recent weeks, convinced someone or something was watching him. The tune, playing at random intervals through the house, was not only untraceable but maddening. A search of the housekeeper's ledger revealed a new name among the service staff, one Mr. Darnley, hired 6 weeks prior as a temporary handyman. No such man had references, nor had he returned after Sir Gregory's death. His last known task, repairing the library paneling, when a photograph of the house staff was shown to several shopkeepers. In the nearby village, one recognized the face of Mr. Darnley immediately. His real name was Harold Finnick, a disgraced composer once sued by Sir Gregory over a stolen sonata, his entire career ruined by the scandal. "I'd say we've found our motive," said Whimsy grimly. Finnick composed this death tune, installed a device to play it, and watched from afar as Gregory unraveled. "And the whistling portrait?" Moffat asked, almost unwillingly. "Part of the act. The sounds seemed to come from everywhere, but with the portrait so prominent and already a bit uncanny, it became the focal point of Gregory's dread." Clever psychological theater. Finnick didn't need to break in, he just needed time, proximity, and a bit of cursed music. As they left the house, the wind picked up again, curling through the halls. For a moment, it almost sounded like a whistle, but Whimsy didn't look back. He had already solved the unsolvable. Lord Peter Whimsy returned to the Balcombe Lane Manor the following morning, less for a renewed examination than to indulge the gnawing sense that something had been overlooked. Bunter followed with quiet efficiency, as always, though Whimsy had said little during breakfast beyond a curt, "Bring the brown notebook." Inspector Moffat was already there, speaking with the late Sir Gregory's solicitor, a lank, sallow man named Kersey, who exuded a chill more biting than the morning mist. Whimsy acknowledged them both with a faint nod and passed through into the library without a word. The portrait was gone now, removed to the constabulary for analysis. Without it, the room felt unbalanced, as though an essential weight had been lifted from the wall, leaving the fireless hearth strangely naked. Whimsy stood a long while in the center of the room, gazing not at the chair or the brandy glass, but at the rug beneath them, the same Persian rug that had been there for years, its intricate pattern dulled by age and ash, but something about its position troubled him now. "Bunter," he murmured, "did you notice this yesterday?" Bunter, ever perceptive, crouched. "Immediately, no, my lord. But now that you mention it, there's a faint groove in the dust beside the edge. The rug's been moved recently." "Precisely. And look here, the legs of the chair don't quite align with the indentations in the pile. Someone replaced it, but not perfectly." They lifted the corner of the rug. Beneath it, the boards were dark and dusty, save for one that bore the faintest hint of a scuff mark, a shallow scratch, crescent-shaped as if something round and metallic had scraped across the wood. "A heel?" Bunter suggested. Whimsy didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a step back and scanned the rest of the room, his gaze passing quickly over the bookshelves, the fireplace, and finally settling on the writing desk. It had been locked the day before, and Moffat had dismissed it as routine. The solicitor held the keys, but now the top drawer was open. He crossed swiftly to it. Inside, the contents were, as expected, stationery, sealing wax, several old letters. But tucked beneath a blotter was something curious, a photograph, folded twice and smudged with age. It showed a woman, unmistakably the same as in the portrait, seated in the very same chair Sir Gregory had died in, only now her eyes weren't turned aside. They stared directly at the camera, mouth closed. No trace of the whistling expression from the painting. Whimsy frowned. He examined the back. No writing. Just then, Elsie the maid stepped into the doorway, startled to find him there alone. "Oh, I'm sorry, sir. I didn't realize." "Quite all right, Miss Elsie," Whimsy said gently, slipping the photograph into his notebook. "Tell me this portrait. Did you ever see it moved before Sir Gregory's death?" Her brow furrowed. "No, sir, not in years. But yes. Well, 2 weeks ago, I found dust on the floor, as though someone had taken it down and put it back. But I thought maybe it was the wind from the chimney. I never mentioned it." "Thank you. Miss Elsie, one last thing. Do you know a Miss Charlotte Ardell?" The name had come to him suddenly, unbidden. It was a fragment from one of Sir Gregory's earlier essays. Half remembered, the inheritance passed not to Charlotte Ardell, though many believed it should have. Elsie blinked. "Miss Charlotte, that was Lady Lanchester's cousin, I think. Used to live here. Long ago. But she left after something. I was little. Heard whispers. And where is she now?" "No one knows, sir. Disappeared. Folks said she quarreled with the family over a will, but no one ever confirmed it." "Indeed," Whimsy murmured. "Thank you." He left the library with renewed purpose. Outside, Moffat was puffing irritably beside the solicitor, who had taken to tapping a silver-tipped cane against his shin. "Inspector," Whimsy called. "Might I have a word with Mr. Kersey?" Moffat looked glad to be rid of him. Kersey, however, arched a skeptical brow. "Lord Whimsy?" "I wonder," Whimsy said, "if Sir Gregory had made any changes to his will recently." The solicitor stiffened. "I'm not at liberty." "Oh, do spare the formalities, Mr. Kersey. We both know the police will ask the same before noon." "I'm merely quicker." Kersey pursed his lips. "Very well, yes. Sir Gregory updated his will 6 weeks ago. The chief change was the reinclusion of a name long absent, Miss Charlotte Ardell." "How generous," Whimsy said softly. "And in the event she could not be found?" "Her share was to pass to a trust held by—" He hesitated. "My office. Temporarily, of course." "Of course." Whimsy turned. As he walked away, Bunter caught up with him. "I don't trust him." Bunter murmured, "Nor I to polished by half. And there's something else." He handed Bunter the photograph. "This doesn't match the painting. At first I thought perhaps the artist used some license. But now I wonder, was the painting altered?" "To what end, my lord?" "To frighten," Whimsy said. "Just like the whistle. A portrait that seems to change subtly, disturbingly, can become quite the psychological lever." Back at their hotel, Whimsy laid out the photo, the cipher, and a transcript of Sir Gregory's final manuscript. He stared at the broken sentence again. "The portrait has begun to what, indeed?" He whispered. "To whistle, to change, or to watch." There was something haunting in the woman's gaze in the photo, clear-eyed, steady, almost defiant, not the haunting muse of the portrait, but a real person with a grievance, and perhaps a reason to return. That night, Whimsy sat long at his desk, rewriting the sequence of musical notes from the cipher, humming each interval aloud. The melody was familiar, grating, anxious. Then he remembered. It was Vox May Ad Te, a 17th-century piece once banned in English churches for its disturbing tonal dissonance. A plea for voice from the shadows. "Finnick didn't write this," Whimsy whispered. "He found it, and someone else used it. Someone who knew its effect. Someone who had once lived in that house, long enough to understand its rooms and passages. Someone perhaps dismissed, forgotten, but not gone." Outside, in the night, a faint whistle rose beneath the wind. The next morning brought a chill fog that clung low to the hedgerows and draped Balcombe Lane in a ghostly silence. Lord Peter Whimsy arrived promptly at 10, Bunter in tow, both wrapped in sensible tweed. Inspector Moffat had arranged for a formal round of questioning in the drawing-room of the manor, and by the time Whimsy entered, 3 figures were already seated in anticipation: Elsie the maid, Mr. Kersey the solicitor, and a housekeeper named Mrs. Penlow, who had maintained the estate for nearly 2 decades. Whimsy settled into a low chair by the hearth, legs crossed, fingers steepled. Moffat stood behind a table with a notebook and a look of bureaucratic duty. But Whimsy's gaze moved lightly from face to face, not unlike a cat deciding which mouse might move first. "I think, Inspector," Whimsy said politely, "it would be productive to hear from Mrs. Penlow first. You've been with the family longest, have you not?" The woman nodded stiffly. She was stout, with the complexion of raw pastry and a voice that bore the weight of regular scolding. "Aye, sir. 23 years. I saw Master Gregory grow from lad to man, indeed. And in all that time, did you ever see him afraid, Mrs.?" Penlow's brows pinched together. "Only once, about a fortnight ago. He took to locking the library door at all hours, even when inside it. Jumped at his own reflection. I asked him if he was feeling poorly, and he near barked at me. And did he say why? No, sir. Only muttered about eyes, were they? Shouldn't be, and something about music he never invited." Whimsy's voice softened. "And the staff, most were dismissed 2 years ago after Lady Lanchester's passing. Elsie stayed. Gregory said he preferred a quiet house. He barely saw guests, only Mr. Kersey here, and occasionally the curate." Whimsy turned slightly. "Did you ever meet a Mr. Finnick?" "Never heard of him till yesterday." "Curious," Whimsy mused. "And what about the portrait?" Mrs. Penlow shuddered. "Always gave me the creeps, that one. I told her ladyship it didn't belong with the others. She said it was her grandmother's cousin. Painted after a long illness, but something always felt off about it." He watched her carefully. No hesitation, no lonely discomfort, and not the sort bred from guilt. He moved on. "Thank you, Mrs. Penlow. That will do for now. Elsie, do come forward." The maid did so with evident nerves, her hands wringing her apron. Whimsy gave her a kind smile. "You said you heard whistling before discovering the body. Have you heard it since?" Elsie hesitated. "Twice, sir. Once that night. Once again yesterday morning." "Can you describe the sound?" "Not exactly. It doesn't sound right. It starts like a tune, then just wanders, like someone lost in their own head." "Did you ever notice Mr. Kersey coming to the house at unusual hours?" At this, her eyes flicked nervously toward the solicitor. "I know, not at night. He came on Tuesdays, always around noon. And yet the delivery boy swears he saw Mr. Kersey's motor car outside the house last Friday. After dark. That's unusual, wouldn't you agree?" The color drained slightly from Kersey's cheeks. But before he could interrupt, Whimsy leaned forward, voice still mild. "Elsie, if you remember anything else, anything at all, please don't let your fear of consequence stand in the way of justice. That sound you heard may have been more than mischief." She nodded slowly and retreated. Whimsy let the silence grow thick before he finally turned to Kersey. "Well then, Mr. Kersey, a Friday night visit." Kersey adjusted his collar. "Very well. I stopped by briefly to drop off a document Gregory requested. I thought it best not to announce a change in the will to the staff, especially when he asked me to be discreet." "And what was the change?" Kersey paused. "Then, he wanted to remove Charlotte Ardell's name again. He said he'd been mistaken, that she was manipulating him from afar." "And did you advise him to seek help?" "I did, repeatedly. But Sir Gregory believed he was in control. He wasn't mad, Lord Whimsy, just obsessed." "Obsessed with what?" Kersey took a long breath. "With guilt. About Charlotte. About the inheritance. He was convinced she'd return to claim what was hers, the tune, the portrait. He believed they were signals, that she was warning him." "And you didn't believe him?" "I believed he was unraveling. I didn't think he'd die over it." Whimsy said nothing for a moment. Then he asked, "Did you ever meet Miss Ardell?" "Once, many years ago. She had spirit." "I'll say that." "Refused to be shuffled aside. After her aunt's death, when the family chose Gregory as sole heir, she vanished." "Where to?" "No idea. But I heard rumors she'd been living abroad. France, perhaps, or Vienna." "Thank you." As Kersey retreated into his cold composure once more, Whimsy rose and walked slowly to the sideboard where a collection of brandy glasses sat untouched. He picked one up, held it to the light. "Inspector," he said idly, "isn't it strange that Sir Gregory was found with a full glass, yet the decanter was almost empty?" Moffat frowned. "You think someone else drank with him? Possibly. Or someone poured out the contents afterward. But why?" He turned to Bunter. "Do you remember where the other glasses were yesterday? All in the cabinet, my lord, except this one. Which means someone made a point of clearing the others away." He looked at Moffat. "A small detail, perhaps, but in my experience, those are the ones that matter." That evening, as Whimsy returned to his hotel, a telegram awaited him. It bore only a name and address. Charlotte Ardell, Maida Vale, London. He stared at the message, then at the photograph in his pocket, the same defiant eyes, the same challenge in the line of her mouth. Someone in this house had known she was alive, and someone wanted that secret buried with Gregory Lanchester. Rain had begun to streak the windows of Whimsy's Maida Vale Hotel by the time he finished. Dressing, the telegram sat on the writing desk like a silent dare. Charlotte Ardell, Maida Vale, London, close by too close for coincidence. By 9:30, he stood at the entrance to a modest Edwardian building tucked off Elgin Avenue. Its brass number plate dulled with neglect. A landlady with frizzled hair and a distracted air answered his knock. Yes? Forgive the intrusion, Lord Peter Whimsy. I've reason to believe a Miss Charlotte Ardell resides here. Is she in? The woman blinked at the name, then frowned. Miss Ardell moved out 3 days ago. Left no forwarding address. Whimsy's. Pulse quickened. Did she say where she was going? No, just paid up her rent and left. She said she was done watching shadows. Watching from where? A pause. The landlady hesitated, then gestured to a flat across the street. Said she took it for the view of some house nearby. Spent hours by the window, never opened the blinds. Odd woman. Did she leave anything behind? The landlady's frown deepened, but eventually led him upstairs. The flat was bare save for a chair by the window and a pile of crumpled music. Sheets in the bin. Whimsy picked one up, scrawled across it, in faint pencil, Vox May Ad T. The same unearthly tuned dot so Charlotte had been watching. The question was watching whom? Back at Balcombe Lane. Moffat was poring over Kersey's timetable with rising irritation. No firm alibi for Friday evening, he muttered. Says he was at his club. But no one recalls him. Whimsy rubbed his chin, because he wasn't meant to be remembered. In and out, unnoticed. That's how Kersey likes it. Moffat looked up. You think he's the killer? I think he's hiding something. But motive, not quite. He walked to the window and stared out across the lawn. Let's recap. Gregory reinstates Charlotte in the will. Then he revokes it, days before his death. Why fear? Moffat said. You heard what Penlow said. He thought she was haunting him. Or someone made him believe that. The whistle, the altered portrait. This isn't the language of murder. It's theater. Someone wanted him terrified. But why frighten him first, then kill him? Whimsy turned. That's the riddle, unless, of course, the killer didn't intend to kill him at all. Moffat gave a skeptical grunt. Dead is dead, Whimsy. True. But what if the plan was only to unnerve him, shake him into signing something, or retracting something, and something went wrong? They both turned as Elsie entered hesitantly. Beg pardon, but there's someone downstairs asking. For Lord Whimsy. A woman. Whimsy stiffened. Did she give a name? No, sir. But she said, he'll know me. He was down the stairs in seconds. Charlotte Ardell stood in the foyer with a calm that was almost defiant. Her dark eyes met his without flinching. The same eyes from the photo, but older, wiser, sharper. No ghost, no hysteric. Flesh and blood. You've come a long way, he said softly. I've never really left, she replied. They sat in the library, beside the empty space where the portrait had hung. You had him terrified, Whimsy said at last. I didn't intend to, she said. Not at first. I only wanted what was mine. The inheritance was promised to me until they changed the will behind my back. So you returned? Yes, quietly. I never entered the house. I watched. I sent the music anonymously. I knew it would stir his memory. I even hired a man to paint the altered portrait. Gregory had it reframed after seeing it. Said it felt more expressive. He never realized it had changed. Why all the secrecy? Because Gregory hated being confronted. I wanted him to choose guilt over arrogance. I wanted him to confess, to face what he'd done. But he didn't. No, she said bitterly. He revoked the will again. Mr. Kersey saw to that. Whimsy frowned. And the night he died. Where were you? In that flat on Elgin Avenue. I watched the light go out in this room at 11:30. No visitors. No one left. Yet someone was with him. One glass wasn't washed. Charlotte leaned forward. Then it wasn't me. Whimsy believed her. She didn't wear the mask of innocence. She wore the bruises of having been wronged and kept standing. Later that afternoon, Whimsy and Bunter reviewed the household ledgers. Two payments, both under miscellaneous repairs, stood out. One to a man named Doyle listed as a framer, another to A. Finnick, piano restoration. He tapped the second name. That's our ghost. The address led them to a shop front in Shoreditch. Dusty and near collapse. Inside, a man in a leather apron looked up from tuning a clavichord. Finnick, you're not here for repairs, Whimsy introduced himself. Did you work on a project for Sir Gregory Lanchester recently? Finnick nodded slowly. He wanted an old tune restored. Had a broken musical cipher. Said it haunted him. Did you recognize the melody? Finnick hesitated. I told him I didn't. But I did. Old ecclesiastical piece, not something you used to impress guests. It unnerved him. Paid me double to stop working on it. Did he mention who gave it to him? No names. Only said, she's speaking again, as they left. Bunter muttered, layers within layers, my lord. Yes, Whimsy said, stepping into the rain. But the shape of the web is beginning to show. By evening, they returned to Balcombe for one final pass through the library. Whimsy moved like a man on rails now. He examined the cabinet again, the rug, the chair, then paused, staring at the small footstool beside the fire. He bent, lifted it. A small brass key clattered to the floor, to new, to clean. Bunter, he said, that drawer we tried the first day, the one with the false lock. They tried the key. Inside lay one folded sheet of paper, a letter, unsigned. To amend the will as agreed. Should my health deteriorate further, I entrust Kersey with my instructions, pending Charlotte's reappearance, should she return in peace. Her claim stands. If not, destroy this. The ink was fresh. Whimsy stood slowly. So, Gregory had softened. He wanted to do right by her after all, quietly. But someone else, someone who stood to lose everything, decided otherwise. And now, at last, the motive began to fit. Kersey knew Charlotte was back. He'd seen her name added, seen it revoked, then added again. And he knew the moment she stepped foot in London, the balance of inheritance would tip. Gregory's final draft, the one in this drawer, had never been meant for the courts. It had been meant for Kersey's safe, or his fireplace. But with Gregory dead, it had become dangerous. And only one man had the motive to bury it with him. Inspector Moffat's voice echoed down the tiled hallway of Balcombe Lane Manor, with the hard-edged satisfaction of a man who believed the game was over. We've just had confirmation from Kersey's bank, he told Whimsy briskly, waving a sheaf of papers. He withdrew £5,000  2 days before Gregory's death. Cash, no record of where it went. No mention in any of Lanchester's files. You see it, don't you? Blackmail. Whimsy examined the letter again, the one hidden in the drawer with the brass key. His eyes traced the strokes of ink slowly, as if they might rearrange themselves under scrutiny. And you believe Kersey killed him to prevent this draft from ever seeing daylight? It fits. He had means, motive, opportunity, and a shaky alibi, and Gregory's nerves were already unraveled. Kersey nudged him over the edge. Whimsy's brow creased. But nudged with what? Precisely. We still have no murder weapon. No sign of poison. The body bore no marks. The brandy showed no tampering. And oddly, the only forensic oddity was the absence of fingerprints. Someone wiped the room clean. Why bother if it was meant to look natural? Moffat gave an irritable shrug. A professional touch, panic, or just Kersey being thorough. But that's just it, Whimsy murmured. Kersey isn't thorough. He's cautious, methodical, but not clever enough to forge fear. He's the sort who writes memos to himself. The altered portrait, the music, the staged psychological spiral. That's artistry. Moffat grunted. You're doubting a confession of facts for the scent of drama. I'm doubting coincidence. Whimsy said, you say £5,000 is proof of guilt. I say it's too convenient. But Moffat, buoyed by the clarity of the paper trail, proceeded without him. Kersey was summoned to the local station house that afternoon. Within an hour, he was charged with obstruction and suspected murder. The news reached the press. Within the day, solicitor rested in Lanchester mystery. Charlotte, quiet and composed, received the news with a complicated expression Whimsy could not read. That's it, then, Moffat said that evening. drying his hands after dinner. We'll sort out the specifics in court. The rest is smoke. But Whimsy stood by the fireplace, in the library, staring at the space where the portrait had once hung. He watched the flicker of flame and said nothing. Later that night, long after the manor had gone to sleep, he wandered the halls. Something gnawed at him, elusive and persistent. The key, the brandy glass, the missing fingerprints, the whistling tune, the haunting Charlotte never intended. A trail of breadcrumbs, yes, but leading where? He paused before the empty picture frame leaning against the wall in the drawing room. The portrait had been sent to the station as evidence, but the backing board still lay on the carpet, a faint crease running diagonally through its center. He bent to examine it. A slit. He pried it gently, revealing a hidden cavity between the canvas and frame, empty now but large enough to hold something thin. A letter, perhaps, or sheet music. So the portrait had not merely been altered, it had been used. The next morning, before the fog lifted, he made his way back to Shoreditch. Finnick, the piano restorer, answered the door, suspicious but not unfriendly. "You again," he said. "What now?" "Humor me," Whimsy said. "When Gregory brought you the tune, did he ask you to record it?" Finnick hesitated. "He asked me to press a wax cylinder. Said it had to be exact. Took me hours. Paid me triple. Where is it?" The man led him to a battered shelf behind his workbench. After a moment's rummaging, he retrieved a dusty box. "I never delivered it. The night before I was due to drop it off. He called and said to forget the whole thing." Sounded terrified. Whimsy took the box carefully. "May I borrow this?" Finnick looked doubtful, but nodded. Back at Balcombe, Whimsy and Bunter rigged up the old phonograph from the library. The cylinder clicked into place, and with a low hiss, the tune emerged. It was haunting, soft, almost human, a melody without anchor. It drifted like fog, unfixed, unsettling. Whimsy listened twice, then a third time. He motioned to Bunter. "Fetch Charlotte." She came within minutes, looking guarded. He nodded toward the machine. "Did you write this?" "No, I only hummed it. Whistled it once or twice to a courier. Gregory and I both remembered it from childhood. Our mothers sang it, though we never found the source." He frowned. "Then who turned it into this?" They listened again. This time, the whisper beneath the melody became unmistakable. Not just notes, a voice, muffled, faint, just one word, repeated softly in the middle bars. "Help." Bunter looked up, startled. Charlotte's hand tightened on the chair. Whimsy rose slowly. "Kersey wouldn't think to embed a message in music. That's theater." Charlotte's voice was quiet. "Then who?" But Whimsy was already moving. Down the corridor, past the stairwell, into the modest quarters behind the kitchen. He opened the door without knocking. Mrs. Penlow sat in her chair by the fire, darning wool. She looked up, calm as ever. "Ah, Lord Whimsy, I wonder," he said, "whether you might have something to tell me about the portrait." She blinked. "What portrait?" "The one you loathed, the one that terrified your master, the one you watched change, frame by frame, because you were the one replacing it." She said nothing. "You were the only one who could. You cleaned that room. You had the key. You knew the hiding spot behind the canvas. You set the stage." She sighed and set her knitting aside. "You never liked him," she said. He tilted his head. "Gregory," she continued, "cruel as a winter wind. When Charlotte was denied, I said nothing. When he dismissed half the staff without pension, I bit my tongue. But when he started hearing the music, seeing eyes in paint, that I knew. You wanted him frightened." She nodded. "I never laid a finger on him. I only gave him a mirror. And the brandy? I wiped the room after, found him slumped in the chair, gone. Not a mark on him. I thought, if it looked tidy, maybe no one would question. But someone was there," Whimsy said. "Someone who came later, who tampered with the portrait, who heard the message in the tune and decided it was too dangerous to remain." He leaned forward. "Kersey didn't kill Gregory. He panicked after. But someone else, someone closer, decided the game was already over and wiped away the last traces." Mrs. Penlow looked up slowly, her lips thin, and finally, she whispered, "There was someone else." Whimsy didn't smile. He only turned toward the door, a chill crawling across his spine. He had found a lie at the center of the storm. But the one who had shaped the storm was still in hiding, and watching, waiting for him to blink. The next morning broke with a hush over Balcombe Lane. As if the manor itself were waiting, Lord Peter Wimsey stood in the library, the cold morning sun casting long shadows over the oak floorboards. The wax cylinder still sat beside the phonograph, the voice caught in its spiraling grooves like a ghost repeating its unfinished plea. The word help lingered in his mind not just as a cry, but as a signal, a thread reaching backward into something unfinished. He unrolled the notes. He had taken names, times, statements, fragments, and circled the word portrait. Not just any portrait, a specific one, commissioned shortly after Gregory returned from Vienna, painted by an artist who had since vanished into obscurity, and altered, frame by frame, with the kind of precision that required more than steady hands. It required access, opportunity, and motive. But the portrait wasn't the only relic from Gregory's past that cast a shadow. He returned to the drawing room where Charlotte sat at the window, sketchpad resting in her lap. She glanced up as he entered. "Is Kersey still in custody?" she asked. "For now, but I don't think he'll stay there long." He panicked. Yes, but he didn't orchestrate this. She closed her sketchpad. "Then who did?" He gestured to the chair across from hers and sat. "Tell me about Vienna." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "You and Gregory studied there, didn't you?" "He under a composer whose name has been struck from the records. You under a painter, Karl Reimann." She went still. "I spoke to someone at the embassy. Reimann's works are rare now. Many were destroyed in the war, but your brother bought several of them. One, in particular, hung here for a time until he had it removed, the one of the violinist." Charlotte murmured. Wimsey nodded. "A self-portrait. And when it was taken down, what replaced it?" Her lips parted. "The one that frightened him." "Exactly. But it wasn't only the painting that disturbed him, it was what it reminded him of." She looked down at her hands. "There was an accident in Vienna. A student, Maxim Klein. He played in the conservatory with Gregory. One night, there was a fire in the practice hall. He died in it. Gregory escaped. There were rumors, but..." Wimsey leaned forward. "But nothing was ever proven." She nodded slowly. "Gregory came home changed. He drank more, shut himself away, and he never spoke of Vienna again." "And the painter?" "Reimann vanished not long after the fire. Rumors again, connections to certain movements, dealings with unconventional patrons. Gregory stopped collecting his work." Wimsey rose. "Then the ghosts of Vienna came home with him. I believe someone wanted to ensure those ghosts had a voice, that the memory of Maxim Klein, of that fire, would rise again." That afternoon, Bunter returned from London with a parcel newspapers from 12 years ago, buried in the archives. The Vienna fire had received a single paragraph in the Times. "British student escapes conservatory blaze, another dead." No names mentioned, but tucked in a German-language clipping, the full account emerged. Maxim Klein, a scholarship violinist, promising, trapped in a locked practice room. The door jammed from the outside. Police suspected faulty hinges, but his family claimed otherwise. His sister, an art student, had filed a report claiming it was murder. Wimsey ran his finger along the column. The sister's name, Margarethe Klein. He read it again, and then slowly turned toward the sketch on Charlotte's desk. The lines were fluid, deliberate. A woman's face in profile, unmistakably composed, even as it blurred into abstraction. Not Charlotte's usual hand. She didn't draw this, he said aloud. Moments later, he was in the garden studio, the one Charlotte rarely used. Dust covered the easel, but in the corner lay a portfolio. Inside were half a dozen sketches, all done in the same style, expressionist, fractured. A hand here, a violin scroll there, the arch of an eyebrow, each one more frantic than the last. And in the final page a full name, Margarethe Klein. Wimsey stared, the pulse at his temple rising. The drawings weren't merely memories, they were studies, preparatory sketches for something larger. He returned to the manor and requested Charlotte join him once more. "You knew her," he said without preamble. "Margarethe, you studied with her." She didn't deny it. "She was kind to me when I first arrived. I admired her work. But after Maxim died, she changed. She blamed Gregory, accused him of locking the door. Did he? Charlotte hesitated, then whispered, "I never asked. I didn't want to know." And now her gaze didn't waver. "Now I wonder if I was complicit. I brought her back here. She visited last autumn. Briefly." Whimsy drew a long breath. "She stayed longer than you think. She didn't just visit, she embedded herself. The sketches, the tune, the altered portrait. She wanted Gregory to see her, to remember, to feel it. But he never recognized her." Charlotte murmured, "No, but someone else might have." He turned toward the hallway, then paused. "She didn't act alone. Someone here helped her. Someone who knew the manor well, who understood how to avoid suspicion." Charlotte stood slowly. "Penlow, no. Penlow protected you. She wouldn't invite danger in. But someone else with an old grudge, perhaps. Someone who resented Gregory just enough to turn a blind eye." The air thickened with memory. Ghosts did not rise on their own, they were summoned. And someone had opened the door willingly. Wimsey left the room, his mind racing. The past was no longer distant, it was stitched into the very walls of Balcombe Lane. Vienna was not an echo, it was a spark, and someone had fanned it into flame. And now, with the false trail of Christie cooling, the real architect was preparing their next move, one that reached deeper than grief or revenge. This was not merely about Gregory Lanchester's death. It was about finishing something started 12 years ago, and Whimsy intended to be there when the final note played. That evening, Lord Peter. Whimsy stood once more before the portrait that had whistled, the portrait that had watched. The false sense of stillness in the manor had returned, but it was thinner now, like varnish on cracked oil paint. He studied the frame, the layers of overpaint, the edges where Margaretha Klein had touched her past into life. Gregory Lanchester's face stared outward, but something lurked behind the brush strokes. Remorse, recognition, perhaps even fear. But the dead did not whisper, only the living did. And Whimsy was convinced one of them was still lying. He required something unusual. The truth lay entangled in silence and denial, and to unravel it, he would need a tool sharper than mere questioning. He sent Bunter to town with specific instructions. While the valet was away, Whimsy invited each of the remaining houseguests for separate teas in the conservatory, a location carefully chosen. It overlooked the stone garden, which had excellent acoustics, and it was positioned just above the hallway where the phonograph had been kept. By the following afternoon, everything was in place. Whimsy began with Dr. Elric Mortimer. The man entered, with his usual scholarly detachment, accepting tea with long fingers and sipping it like an alchemist inspecting a compound. "I'm testing a little theory today," Whimsy said lightly. "A bit of a parlor game, if you will. I've been replaying the recording from the phonograph just to see who reacts." Mortimer raised an eyebrow. "You believe the voice will mean something to someone?" "I believe it already has," Whimsy said, pouring himself another cup. "But what's fascinating is not the voice itself, it's the silence afterward. I don't follow. The voice says help, and then the cylinder continues for full seconds empty, but uninterrupted. Whoever recorded it didn't turn it off in panic. They let it run. What were they waiting for? An answer." Mortimer tapped his chin. "Or maybe they wanted to be sure the message would reach someone." Whimsy smiled. "And did it?" Mortimer met his gaze evenly. "If it did, they didn't listen in time." After Mortimer left, Whimsy called in the next, Mrs. Whitcomb. Her lips were taut, her eyes restless. He offered her a scone. She barely touched it. "I do hope you're not still unnerved by that business with Christie," Whimsy said. "They'll be releasing him, you know. Not enough to hold him." "Then it wasn't him?" she asked. He panicked. "But I doubt he planned anything. No. Whoever orchestrated this wanted more than violence, they wanted retribution." He paused, letting his tone dip to something darker, perhaps for an old fire. Her teacup trembled slightly in its saucer. "I'm afraid I don't understand." Whimsy leaned back. "You knew Charlotte studied in Vienna." A pause. "Briefly, yes. She mentioned it once." "Did she ever speak of Margaretha Klein?" "No." "Curious. They were quite close." Mrs. Whitcomb's mouth tightened, but she said nothing. When she left, she cast a glance at the corridor as though expecting someone to be listening. Whimsy's final visitor of the evening was the most intriguing Charlotte herself. He brought out the phonograph again, this time with a fresh cylinder. As the machine began to spin, it didn't play the original voice, but something else, faint strains of a violin, hesitant and halting, recorded on a wire track Bunter had unearthed from a pawnshop in London. Charlotte's eyes widened as the music played. That's Maxim's piece, the one he wrote for his sister. Bunter found an old recital tape. Whimsy lied smoothly. It was in the embassy's cultural records. You recognized it immediately. Charlotte nodded slowly. We used to play it together. Before the fire, Whimsy shut off the machine. I believe Margaretha used the tune deliberately. The musical box inside the portrait played it. She wanted Gregory to hear it in his final hours. Charlotte looked away. To torment him? To haunt him? He stood and walked to the window. Outside, the stone garden was dark, the lanterns unlit. There's something curious about music, you know. It bypasses reason. It evokes memory. That's why I chose this approach. A lie can hide in conversation, but when a melody plays, the truth listens. She looked up at him, a flicker of pain in her face. So what now? You think I brought her here to finish something? I think you brought her here out of kindness, but someone else let her stay. The next morning, Whimsy gathered the household once more in the drawing room. Bunter entered last, carrying a small velvet box. Inside was the fragment of the musical mechanism, twisted, charred, but unmistakably intact. I had it tested, Whimsy said to the room. The melody matches one written by Maxim Klein. Margaretha embedded it into the frame. Penlow furrowed her brow. But how did she get access? She was here last autumn, Charlotte said quietly. I let her stay in the East Wing while Gregory was abroad. She said she needed time to work. I never thought. She altered the painting. Whimsy finished, layer by layer, each stroke embedded with memory. But she wasn't alone. His gaze fell on Mortimer. You were in Vienna once, weren't you, Doctor? Mortimer tilted his head, briefly. On sabbatical. Why? Because Margaretha wrote to someone just before the incident. I found the letter in her sketchbook. It mentions a confidant, a fellow traveler, someone who believed in unveiling old sins. He stepped forward. You provided her with Gregory's schedule. You smuggled the recording into the phonograph. You thought it would break him. Mortimer smiled faintly. Break him? No, Lord Peter. I thought it would remind him of what he took, of the music he silenced. Charlotte gasped softly. You helped her kill him. I didn't kill him, Mortimer said, but I allowed the truth in. That was all she needed. Whimsy turned to the others. Margaretha Klein has fled, but Mortimer here will be detained for conspiracy to commit manslaughter. He claims he merely enabled a performance. He paused, but I think he underestimated how far guilt can carry a note. And as Mortimer was led away, Whimsy turned back toward the portrait. The face remained fixed, the eyes unknowable. But the room felt quieter now. The melody had ended. The truth, such as it was, had played its final refrain. The storm that rolled over the hills that night did little to cool the charged atmosphere at Avondale Manor. Lightning clawed at the sky, and the wind hissed through the trees like a warning. No one heeded. Lord Peter Whimsy, however, was unbothered by theatrics. He had set the last piece of the board into place. Mortimer was arrested. Margaretha was missing, and the threads of the Klein tragedy finally lay exposed under the drawing room chandelier. But even as the household tried to sleep, Whimsy stayed. Restless, he paced the long gallery where the portrait hung, staring again at the charred remains of the music box and the cracked panel behind the canvas. Everything fit almost too well. He had built his case upon Margaretha's presence, Mortimer's collusion, and the haunting message embedded in melody. But something gnawed at him, a sliver of disquiet. The case had come together too smoothly after so much confusion, as if someone wanted it concluded, as if someone else had composed the final bars. Bunter's knock broke the silence. My lord, the valet said with a furrowed brow, you may wish to see this. He handed Whimsy a small black case, the very same that had held the broken music mechanism, now conspicuously light. Whimsy flipped open the lid. It was empty. Where did you find this? It was left in the library alcove, beneath the phonograph table. Miss Vane noticed it while arranging the detective's notes. Whimsy narrowed his eyes, and the mechanism, gone. Within the hour, the household was roused again. The servants assembled first, bleary-eyed and nervous, then the remaining guests, Mrs. Whitcomb, Charlotte, Penlow, and Inspector Collingswood, who had returned at Whimsy's request. The mood had turned. What had felt like closure now trembled. On the edge of something more dangerous. The most vital piece of our evidence, Whimsy announced, holding up the empty box, has vanished. Murmurs buzzed through the room. It was under lock and key. Penlow said sharply, "It was." Whimsy agreed. "And yet, here we are." Charlotte stepped forward. "Could it have been Margarethy? If she returned somehow," Whimsy studied. "Her, that would require an audacity I'm not sure even she possesses. Or," Penlow said coldly, "someone here wishes this case to remain unresolved." Whimsy nodded toward the inspector. "Collingswood has agreed to conduct a search of the manor. Discreetly, but thoroughly." Collingswood's men moved quickly. Every room, closet, and servants' corridor was inspected. The east wing, once sealed off, yielded only dust and ashes. But in the west attic, a place used to store paintings and household artifacts, one of the constables found something peculiar. A burnt scrap of cloth and a scorched wire cylinder lay nestled among antique frames. It matched the phonograph's missing piece. Whimsy examined the remains in silence. "The damage is deliberate," he said. "Not accidental. Someone destroyed it in a hurry," Collingswood added grimly, "and not recently. The fire was likely set within an hour of Mortimer's arrest. Then the saboteur acted immediately." Whimsy muttered, "Who would have the foresight and access to get up here without detection?" The question hung in the air like the scent of smoke. That evening, Whimsy called only to people into the drawing room, Charlotte and Mrs. Whitcomb. "I find myself caught between diversions of grief," he said. "One that seeks justice, and one that seeks concealment." Mrs. Whitcomb folded her arms. "You believe someone among us sabotaged your case?" "I believe someone here feared that the case was about to take a turn one they couldn't allow." Charlotte stood still as marble. "Why us?" "Because of access," Whimsy said gently. "And because of motive. Charlotte, you trusted Margarethy. You let her stay. And you were the one who suggested hiding the mechanism in the first place." Charlotte didn't flinch. "I didn't want the others tampering with it." "And Mrs. Whitcomb," he turned to her, "you have been on edge since the very first day. You told me you didn't know Margarethy well, but I checked with the Vienna Conservatory. You were there too, in 1934. Her face drained of color. I barely remember her. Yet Margarethy painted a small study during that year, a group portrait. You're in it." Silence. "She never forgave Gregory." Whimsy continued, voice softer now. "But I think Margarethy expected justice to come from the system. When it didn't, she took matters into her own hands. But someone else feared what her plan might expose. Not just Gregory's sins, but others as well." Charlotte's voice broke the silence. "You're saying Mrs. Whitcomb helped destroy the evidence?" Whimsy looked at her, but didn't answer directly. "The person who burned the mechanism knew the manor well, knew the routine, knew how to slip away. During the confusion, someone who seemed irrelevant, someone above suspicion." He reached into his coat and pulled out a half-melted latchkey. "Bunter found this in the attic. It opens the servants' stairwell." Mrs. Whitcomb stared at it for a long moment. "It's not mine." "No," Whimsy agreed. "It belonged to your late husband, didn't it? I believe he left it with you before he died. And you've kept it ever since." She sank slowly into a chair. "I didn't want all of it to come out," she said, barely above a whisper. "Gregory wasn't the only man who abandoned her. My husband, he knew about what happened to the Klein family. He was part of it, not the worst, but guilty all the same. If the case gained too much attention, his name might surface again. My son's position would suffer. Why not speak with Margarethy yourself?" "I tried. She wouldn't see me, only Charlotte. She believed I had stood by. She wasn't wrong." Charlotte stepped forward and laid a hand on the woman's shoulder. "You could have told me. She didn't want you ruined too." Collingswood arrived minutes later and took her gently into custody. No charges had yet been laid, none. Perhaps would be, but she had confessed to interfering with evidence. and the law would need its due dot as the storm began to pass and dawn crept over the hills. Whimsy found himself once again in the gallery. The portrait remained damaged and mute, but still watching. Bunter joined him with 2 cups of tea. "So," Bunter said, "does this bring us closer to the end?" Whimsy stared out the window, eyes tracing the faint glint of morning over the manor grounds. "No," he said, "it merely removes another mask." And somewhere, in the distance, a bird sang a single, high-pitched note, soft, like a whistle. Through canvas. The calm that settled over Avondale Manor was a brittle one, like a fragile crust over seething water. The confession from Mrs. Whitcomb had soothed the immediate storm. Yet to Lord Peter Wimsey it felt more like the eye of a far greater tempest. She had admitted to destroying the music box mechanism, to hiding connections with a buried past, but the confession, however sincere, had not clarified everything. Something remained elusive, out of tune, as though one last note had yet to be struck out by the following morning. Inspector Collingswood was prepared to release most of the guests. Mortimer's guilt had been legally established, and Mrs. Whitcomb's interference now explained the disappearance of the key evidence. Yet Wimsey lingered, unconvinced. It wasn't just the case's shape that troubled him, it was its timing. Margarethy had orchestrated her entire performance with precision. She had meant to force revelation, not escape it. And if she had left the manor alive, as evidence suggested, where had she gone? Why had she not resurfaced? Late that afternoon, Bunter returned from the nearby post office in town, holding a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. "This arrived just now," he said. "No return address. Postmarked yesterday morning before the music box was found destroyed." Wimsey opened it carefully. Inside was a folded scrap of manuscript paper, a musical stave inked with a single strange measure, 5 descending notes, the last circled in red. Alongside it lay a small brooch, Margarethy's, the same she had worn in the photograph with Gregory. "She sent this," Wimsey murmured, "or someone who wants you to think she did." Wimsey stared at the musical notation, then rose at once. "Fetch Inspector Collingswood, and check every entrance to the manor. No one comes or goes without us knowing." An hour later, they gathered in the music room where Margarethy had first performed. Wimsey laid the music on the grand piano. "This note sequence C, A, G, F, E. It's not part of the Klein piece. It's something else, a message or a signal." Collingswood said grimly, "A threat." Before Wimsey could answer, a shrill cry rang out from the upstairs corridor. The men bolted toward the sound. Footsteps thundering on the stairs. It came from Charlotte's room. She stood by the window, white as snow. "He's gone," she whispered. "Who?" "Penlow. He was just here. He wanted to discuss the household's finances. I left him for a moment to fetch the ledger. When I came back, the window was open, and she pointed. That." Wimsey leaned out and saw a length of torn curtain knotted to the drainpipe. Penlow had escaped. Within moments, the manor grounds were combed. One of the footmen found fresh boot prints leading into the wood. Another reported a bicycle missing from the rear shed. Penlow was gone. Collingswood scowled. What would he run from unless he feared discovery? "He was to calm all this time," Wimsey said. "To quiet. I thought it was poise, but now I suspect it was calculation." By dusk, another visitor arrived unexpectedly. Inspector Bell from Scotland Yard, summoned discreetly by Collingswood earlier in the week. "There's something you need to hear," Bell said, handing over a typed memo. "We've identified the man Margarethy registered with in Dover under the name Margaret Kay. She gave his boarding house as her contact. He turned up dead this morning, bludgeoned. No sign of her." Wimsey felt the room shift under his feet. "Margarethy didn't vanish," he said slowly. "She was taken." Bell nodded. "And the only one we know of who had both motive and opportunity who was not under guard the night Mortimer was arrested is Penlow." Wimsey turned to Collingswood. "Have the roads watched. Check trains, check harbors, and for God's sake, question everyone again." That night, sleep was impossible. Wimsey stood once more in the long gallery. Rain pattered on the roof, steady and rhythmic like a ticking clock. The portrait loomed overhead, its edges still marred by fire, the face half shadowed, half defiant. And then he heard it, not the storm, not the wind. A sound just beneath it. A faint whistle, 3 notes rising, falling, then rising again. He turned swiftly. Bunter was already at his side. "You heard it?" "Yes, my lord." "Same as before. It's not from the painting," Whimsy murmured. "It never was." He followed the sound through the west corridor, past shuttered guest rooms, toward the old study. There, tucked beneath the floorboards, behind the fireplace, they found another of Margarethy's devices. A hidden phonograph mechanism, triggered by a timer. But why play it now? Collingwood asked when someone Wimsey turned to him, face grim. "Because Penlow wanted us distracted. He knew we'd chase the ghost, not the man. And while we were busy chasing the past, he set his plan in motion." "What plan?" "To silence her. Permanently." Just then a call came through from the village constable. A farmer had spotted 2 figures crossing the lower bridge at daybreak. One was injured, the other pushing a cart. Whimsy was already reaching for his coat. "He's moving her Margarethy's alive, and he's running out of time." They set out into the rising dawn, no longer merely hunting the truth but racing to save it. The early morning mist clung to the rolling fields as Whimsy and Collingwood pressed on, their boots muffled by the wet earth. The farmer's report had been sparse, but precise to figures moving near the old mill road, a route long abandoned by most, but known to locals as a shortcut through dense woods. The urgency of the moment propelled them forward, though Whimsy's mind was anything but chaotic. It was sharpening, every stray thought aligning toward an unseen center. As they navigated the narrow path, the detective's gaze flicked repeatedly to the small items they carried: the broken music box mechanism, the scrap of manuscript, the brooch, all scattered fragments of a puzzle that refused to settle. Yet, amidst the chaos of recent days, a quiet intuition began to hum. "Collingwood," Whimsy began, pausing beside a gnarled oak, its branches heavy with dew. "Have you noticed how each clue, the music box, the manuscript, the whistle, connects through a thread of repetition, almost like a coded refrain?" The inspector grunted, skeptical but attentive. "You mean like a motif? I've heard you talk about those in symphonies before." "Precisely. It's a pattern, not random. The music, the notes, the whistle, these are deliberate signals. But more than that, they echo something far older and more personal." Whimsy's eyes narrowed as he scanned the wood's undergrowth. They came to a halt at a shallow ditch, where the ground bore fresh marks, tracks from a cart's narrow wheels. Whimsy crouched and examined them carefully, tracing a path toward a small clearing shrouded by brambles. The cart's path veered unexpectedly, as if the driver had been forced to abandon it. A faint rustling caught their attention. Emerging cautiously was a figure, pale and gaunt, supported by another man. The woman's eyes fluttered open. Margarethy, weak but alive. Relief surged through Whimsy. Yet he kept his composure, signaling for quiet. Once safely returned to the manor, Margarethy was tended by the house doctor. Her story, once she could speak, was fragmented but revealing. Penlow, she said, was not acting alone. His movements had been dictated by a shadowy figure, someone wielding a deeper grudge than mere financial gain or jealousy. A past wound, something buried decades ago, was driving this nightmarish web. Whimsy pondered her words as the day slipped into evening. Alone in the study, he reviewed his notes, seeking the invisible thread that could explain the inexplicable. The crumpled music manuscript lay beside an old family photograph. Gregory and Margarethy, smiling, but with an odd inscription in Margarethy's handwriting. For every silence, a whisper. Then it struck him. The whispered whistle, 3 notes, was a code rooted in a childhood game Gregory and Margarethy once shared, a secret language passed down through years of friendship and betrayal. The whistling portrait was not just a metaphor. It was a call, a summons for recognition or vengeance. Whimsy summoned Collingwood. The key is not in the surface details, but in what these notes represent. The notes correspond to initials, C, A, G, letters tied to a name, the very name that has eluded us. "Who?" Collingwood asked. "Cargill, a man wronged long ago by the family. A name erased from records, but not from memory." They revisited the old family archives, dusty ledgers and yellowed letters revealing a forgotten scandal. Cargill, a trusted servant accused of theft, dismissed unjustly, his life ruined. His son. believed dead in a distant land, might still be alive and seeking revenge. With this revelation, the investigation's shape altered dramatically. The motives tangled with personal vendettas and old betrayals. Penlow, it seemed, was merely a pawn manipulated by a far craftier hand. As the night deepened, Whimsy knew the final confrontation was nearing. The clues, once random, now danced in a grim choreography, leading inexorably toward truth. The silent whistle echoed again, faint yet persistent, a call that only he could answer. Whimsy stood by the cold fireplace in the Manor's library, his gaze heavy on the flickering shadows that danced across the portraits. Each frame stared back with lifeless eyes, but one in particular, the painting of old Lord Ainsworth, seemed to press on him like a weight. He studied its placement, its strange angle, the way the eyes seemed to follow one across the room. Behind him, Collingswood stirred, shifting nervously. "You believe it's Cargill's son, then?" the inspector asked. "I believe it's someone who wanted to be forgotten," Whimsy replied softly. "Someone who grew up in the very walls of this house. Not an outsider seeking revenge, but an insider protecting a truth." Collingswood frowned, unsure. Whimsy moved closer to the painting, tapping gently along its edge. A hollow knock answered him. He reached up, removed the frame from the wall, and behind it, set into the plaster, was a small iron key embedded in a worn velvet pouch. The initials embroidered on it were unmistakable: CAG. That evening, as the household dined in tense silence, Whimsy had the key examined by a locksmith, who confirmed it belonged to an old music trunk once owned by Gregory's grandfather, and later sealed away in the attic for decades. When they opened it, they found letters, dozens of them, brittle with age, each one addressed to Lord Ainsworth from a woman named Annalise, Cargill's wife. They revealed the entire story. Lord Ainsworth had framed Cargill not for theft, but to silence him. The truth: Annalise had been Ainsworth's former mistress. Gregory's mother, long thought to be Ainsworth's proper wife, had in fact been the second partner. Gregory Ainsworth was not the heir, he was the illegitimate child of Cargill's wife. Gregory had known this. Margarethe, too, they'd discovered the letters together shortly before the engagement. That explained her hesitation about marriage. It wasn't scandal she feared, it was incest. They were half-siblings. Collingswood paled as Whimsy laid it out. "Good God, that's the motive?" "Not just motive," Whimsy said. "It's identity. The killer was not punishing Gregory for a betrayal. He was protecting the bloodline." At that, the drawing-room doors opened and Margarethe entered, slow and pale, still weak but composed. Her eyes met Whimsy's with calm resignation. "I knew," she said quietly. "I knew long before we found the letters. That's why I refused Gregory. Not because I didn't love him, but because I couldn't marry him." "Why keep the secret?" Whimsy asked gently. "Because it was never Gregory's fault. He didn't ask to be born, and I thought," she faltered, "I thought burying it was the only way to save what little dignity the family had left." Whimsy nodded, but his mind turned elsewhere. Someone had killed Gregory not to avenge Cargill but to preserve the lie. Penlow, devoted to the Ainsworth name, had been manipulated into action. But by whom? A footman entered, breathless. "Sir, the gardener's shed, it's on fire." Whimsy and Collingswood raced out into the night air, smoke rising in the distance. They arrived just as the flames were dying down. Among the wreckage was a charred suitcase, its metal frame twisted by heat. Inside, blackened remnants of documents, some of the letters, and a half-melted recorder. Collingswood stared at the destruction. They were trying to erase it all, but they were too late, Whimsy said. "We have copies of the letters, the key, the portraits backing." That was desperation, not calculation. Back in the Manor, Whimsy paced the length of the hall. The killer had acted to preserve the illusion of legitimacy. They feared scandal. Yes, but more than that, they feared being cast out. It wasn't Penlow. It wasn't even Margarethe. It was Aunt Beatrice. The revelation landed in Whimsy's mind with a terrible certainty. Beatrice, the quiet, dutiful spinster aunt, had raised Gregory, run the household, preserved the family image. But more than anyone, she had depended on the lie. Her status, her influence, her entire identity was bound to the Ainsworth legacy. A bastard heir would tarnish everything. She had seen it unraveling. First the engagement's collapse, then the Whispers, she'd turned to Penlow, manipulated his loyalty, fed him pieces of the truth laced with poison. And when Margarethe vanished, she likely believed it was permanent. But when the letters reappeared, she panicked. The fire, the final desperate act to erase the past once more. Whimsy confronted her in the parlor that evening, where she sat, knitting, serene as ever. "You always hated Margarethe's influence on Gregory," he said calmly. "I thought she was too clever by half," Beatrice replied, without looking up. "You feared she'd tell the truth." At this, she paused. "And what truth is that, Lord Whimsy? That you knew Gregory was not Ainsworth's heir. That you chose to preserve a lie rather than let the family line dissolve. You feared irrelevance more than guilt, so you orchestrated a murder, convinced Penlow it was righteous, and destroyed the evidence that proved otherwise." Beatrice smiled faintly, her needles stilling. "I preserved the name, the estate, the honor. Would you really call that murder?" "Yes," Whimsy said flatly, "I would." She rose then, slow and deliberate, as if the final stitch had been made. "I did what had to be done." Her rest was quiet, and she offered no resistance. As she was led away, Whimsy could not help but feel a peculiar sadness, not for her, but for the layers of loyalty, twisted into delusion. In the end, the Wissing portrait had called not for justice, but for reckoning, and it had received it. The silence in the Ainsworth manor was no longer the silence of fear. It was the slow exhale of truths unearthed and lies laid bare. Yet, Lord Peter Wimsey knew the case wasn't finished. Not truly. Beatrice had been arrested, yes, but something gnawed at him still, something about the way she had spoken, so calm, so rehearsed, and one thing she had said kept ringing in his ears. "I did what had to be done, not what I wanted, not what I chose," as if the decision had not been hers alone. Wimsey stood in the corridor outside the morning room, the scent of smoke still lingering faintly on his coat. The portrait of Lord Ainsworth had been returned to the wall, this time level, the illusion of authority intact. But even the most commanding portrait could not rewrite bloodlines. The truth of Gregory's heritage could no longer be buried, and Margarethe would never again look at her reflection without wondering what part of her belonged to betrayal. But it was Penlow who troubled Wimsey most. The valet had vanished after Beatrice's arrest. At first, it seemed he'd gone into hiding out of guilt or fear. But now, after the burning shed, the missing items, and the carefully timed escape, it looked more like strategy. Collingwood confirmed it 2 hours later. Penlow had boarded a train to London, under a false name, with a suitcase almost certainly packed with remaining evidence, or worse, insurance. Wimsey set his trap that evening. He returned to the manor, requesting that only Margarethe remain in the drawing room with him. The fire crackled low as they spoke softly about the letters, the engagement that never was. The shadow Gregory had never escaped. A decanter of port sat untouched between them. Then Wimsey raised his voice, just enough for it to carry. "Of course," he said, "the police won't be able to protect the family's reputation. Not once those other letters are released." Beatrice was careful. "But there's still the matter of Penlow's involvement. If he talks, the creak of a floorboard in the hall was all he needed." Wimsey exchanged a glance with Margarethe, who gave a single nod, then slipped quietly from the room. Outside the door, Penlow froze, caught between retreat and recklessness. But the weight of the bag slung over his shoulder and the desperate hope in his chest urged him forward. He stepped inside. "Milord," he said, voice tight. "You're wrong about the letters." Wimsey turned, calm and slow. "Am I?" Penlow's eyes flicked to the decanter. Beatrice may have believed she was saving the family, but it wasn't her idea. It was never hers to begin with. Wimsey nodded slowly. "Go on." Penlow stepped forward, the bag clutched tighter. "She told me the truth years ago, about Gregory, about the letters. She wanted to burn them even then, but she didn't have the nerve. So she asked me to do it. And did you?" "No," Penlow said, his voice rising. "I hid them. I couldn't bring myself to destroy what might be Gregory's only chance at knowing who he really was. But then he started asking questions. He and Miss Margarethe were digging, comparing dates. I warned Beatrice, and she panicked. She told me Gregory would ruin everything. She said he was a mistake that should never have been born." Wimsey's eyes narrowed. And that was enough for you to kill him? No. Penlow shook his head violently. No. I only meant to frighten him, to get him out of the manor. I put something in his wine to make him ill, just enough to slow him down so I could send him away. But he collapsed before I could move him. He hit his head. I didn't mean for it to happen that way. But you didn't call a doctor. Whimsy said coldly. You moved his body, placed the recorder, arranged the portrait. You made it look deliberate. Penlow's breath trembled, because I knew what it would look like. Beatrice, she told me I had to finish what I started. She said if I didn't, she'd say it was all my idea, that she'd burn the letters, and leave me to take the fall. So you obeyed, Whimsy said, his voice quiet but razor-sharp, and then tried to erase the evidence again, burned the shed, tried to flee. Penlow clutched the bag. I was trying to fix it. I never wanted this. Margarethy reappeared in the doorway, and behind her, 2 constables. Penlow froze, wild-eyed, then suddenly bolted toward the window. But Whimsy was faster than he looked, into strides. He seized Penlow's shoulder and wrenched him back, sending the bag spilling open across the rug. Letters, charred and crumpled, a small vial, and a silver pendant that had once belonged to Annalise. Penlow crumpled to his knees. Broken. I only wanted to serve, he muttered. That's all I ever did. For them, for her. As the constables took him away, Whimsy looked, not at Penlow, but at Margarethy. Her face was unreadable, her eyes dry. I thought I knew this house, she said quietly. You do, Whimsy replied. But like all old houses, it kept some rooms locked for a reason. The truth, finally, spoken in full, could not undo what was done. But it could, perhaps, allow something new to be built. Outside, dawn had begun to stretch across the misty fields, and the portrait of Lord Ainsworth silent, watching looked on at a legacy finally exposed to daylight. Whimsy did not sleep that night. Penlow's confession had brought a grim sense of closure to the house servants spoke in hushed tones, and Margarethy spent the evening alone, walking the frost-hardened paths of the rear garden as if searching for the memory of a life that no longer existed. Beatrice had been transferred to a holding facility, Penlow taken under heavy guard to London, and the press kept at bay for the moment. On the surface, the crime had been solved, and yet something still gnawed at Whimsy. He sat in the library long after midnight, the fire smoldering low. Penlow's words echoed in his head. I only wanted to serve. There was guilt in them. Yes, but not design, not malice. His actions had been reactive, frantic. The orchestration, the calm brutality of the recorder, the manipulation of Beatrice, the precise alignment of false leads, none of that fit Penlow's temperament. He had played a part, but he hadn't written the script. Whimsy rose and moved to the desk. Among the evidence retrieved from Penlow's bag had been a small stack of correspondence. Most were damaged beyond recovery, but one scrap had survived, the corner of a letter. Barely legible, it bore the crest of the Ainsworth estate and was addressed not to Penlow, nor to Beatrice, but to someone else entirely. You must ensure he is removed quietly. He cannot inherit. He must not. The script was written in a fine, elegant hand, not Beatrice's. Margarethy's. Whimsy stared at it, the faint smoke stains along the edge seeming to curl inwards like tendrils of something darker. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then he turned, coat already in hand. He found her in the east wing, in the gallery beneath the great skylight, where the pale light of morning had begun to filter through the leaded glass. She stood before the painting of Gregory, gazing at it in silence. It's a poor likeness, she said, her voice steady. He always hated how his mouth looked when he tried to smile. Said it made him seem like he was keeping secrets. Was he? Whimsy asked softly. Margarethy didn't answer right away. I loved him, she said finally. Not in the way he wanted, but I loved him as only someone who's grown up in another's shadow can love the one who casts it. With envy and admiration and, yes, resentment, Whimsy approached her slowly, slipping the scrap of letter from his coat pocket. You wrote this? Yes. Why? She turned to him, her face unreadable. Because I thought it was the only way to save the family. Beatrice wouldn't act until it was too late. Penlow was malleable, eager to be needed. I knew he'd do what he was told if he believed it came from Beatrice, so I wrote the letters, forged her voice, set the match, so to speak. And Gregory, I never intended him to die, only to leave. I thought if he was discredited or frightened off, he'd vanish into Europe again. But he stayed. He always stayed too long. Whimsy studied her, and for the first time, he saw not the poised daughter of an aristocratic line, but a tactician, cold, calculating, precise. You manipulated them all, he said. I protected them, she replied. Father's legacy, the estate, even Beatrice. Do you think the press would spare her if they knew she was the one who opened the door for Gregory's return? Or that she wrote to him, begging him to come back? Whimsy's voice was low. You made her believe she had killed him. I let her draw her own conclusions, Margarethe said. She needed a reason to surrender. And Penlow, well, he deserved it. He meddled far too much, but he didn't poison Gregory. No, she admitted, that was me, a trace of digitalis in his port. Just enough to weaken him. You knew it might kill him. I suspected, she said, eyes fixed on the portrait, but hoped it wouldn't. There was a silence between them then, thick as the morning fog pressing against the gallery windows. You're brilliant, Whimsy said at last. You anticipated everything, even this moment. Margarethe turned to him. I did. And yet you miscalculated one thing. What's that? That I wouldn't forgive you, he said. That I'd let the law devour someone capable of such elegance. Her brow lifted, cautious. You mean to let me go? I mean to give you a choice. He stepped closer, handing her a sealed envelope. Inside was a passport, a train ticket to Dover, and a bank note. You can leave, he said. Disappear. Vanish into some place where titles don't matter. Or stay and face what comes. And what if I choose neither? She asked. Then I arrest you myself. Margarethe studied him for a long time, then took the envelope. I suppose even a perfect plan needs an ending, she said, almost to herself. And if I'm to disappear, better it be by choice. She stepped past him, graceful as always, and paused only once at the door. For what it's worth, she said. I never meant for it to go this far. No one ever does, Whimsy replied. She vanished down the corridor, her footsteps soft against the marble floor. Whimsy remained alone in the gallery, staring up at Gregory's portrait. The smile really did look like it was keeping a secret. But now, at least, the secret had been told. And somewhere beyond the rising sun, a train waited, and with it, perhaps, the end of the Ainsworth line, not in disgrace, but in silence, as all true ghosts depart. The bitter wind whistled through the station arches at Dover, lifting Margarethe's veil in faint, petulant gusts. She stood on the edge of the platform, with gloved hands folded neatly over a modest carpet bag. The train would arrive in 22 minutes. No one else waited there. No porter, no police. Only the cold steel tracks stretched ahead toward Calais. Toward exile. Or so she thought. Whimsy had not followed her immediately after their conversation in the gallery. He had returned instead to the drawing room, where Beatrice sat beside the unlit hearth, clutching a brooch that had once belonged to their mother. Her gaze was distant, her face pale, but there was something steadier in her now, an uneasy peace. She's gone? Beatrice asked. She is, Whimsy said. She left everything behind. Not everything. She kept her silence. Beatrice closed her eyes. That's more than I deserved. Whimsy studied her carefully. Perhaps, but not more than the truth deserved. Later, as the clock struck 9, Whimsy stood once again in the library where the story had begun. The fire had been rekindled. Inspector Frobisher sat across from him, scowling into his brandy. You're telling me the poison came from Margarethe, he said. It did, and Penlow manipulated. He thought he was protecting Beatrice from scandal. He believed her capable of it, which says more about her performance than her guilt. And Beatrice, she did nothing but love Gregory, poorly and secretly. That's no crime, Frobisher huffed. But we let the real killer walk. Whimsy swirled his glass. Sometimes justice isn't a courtroom. Sometimes it's a corridor in an empty train station. A one-way ticket, and the weight of one's own mind. Frobisher grunted. You're a poet, Whimsy. No, Whimsy murmured, rising. Just a man with a taste for symmetry. When he reached Dover, the train had not yet arrived. Margarethy stood as she had in his vision, poised and dignified, looking out over the sea that would carry her to anonymity. She didn't flinch as he approached. "I knew you'd come," she said. "You always did have a gift for endings. I thought you said I had a choice. You did. But justice has one too." She smiled faintly. "And what does it choose tonight?" "That depends on whether you'll hear the rest of the story." He held up a folded sheet of paper, another letter, but this one typed. "It's from Gregory, found among the contents of a lockbox his solicitor forwarded, dated for days before his death. He wrote it after receiving Beatrice's letter. He knew she didn't poison him. He suspected someone else would try." Margarethy's eyes narrowed. "He expected me, no," Whimsy said. "He suspected Charles. He was already in Italy." "Exactly. Gregory never believed Charles's departure was voluntary. He hinted at pressure, subtle threats, reminders of debts. He feared someone in the family forced Charles out to clear a path. That's why he came back. He meant to confront them." Margarethy's breath caught, and for the first time, a flicker of uncertainty passed over her composed face. "I didn't know that." "No," Whimsy agreed. "But it changes the game, doesn't it? Because Charles left in disgrace." "Yes, but not defeated. He's been in Rome these past months, quietly rebuilding his fortune. A new patron, a few discreet commissions, and now, with Gregory gone," Margarethy's gaze hardened, "he inherits, and perhaps," Whimsy said. "He meant to all along." She turned away, but Whimsy followed. "You weren't the only one playing at shadows, Margarethy. You thought yourself the puppet master, but someone else may have moved the strings first. Why tell me this now? Because I want you to understand something before you leave. You weren't wrong, but you weren't right either. You saw only one threat and moved against it, and in doing so, you cleared the field for a far more dangerous one." She stared out at the water, trembling now. "What do I do with that?" "You leave, quietly, and I ensure Charles's return is properly watched." She said nothing for a long moment. "Then you never intended to arrest me?" "No," he said, "but I did intend to let you live with the full shape of what you did." The train's whistle sounded in the distance. The faint thrum of wheels approached. Margarethy picked up her bag. As she stepped onto the train, she paused in the doorway. "Will you tell Beatrice?" "I'll tell her the truth," Whimsy said, "but not the details." She nodded, disappeared into the car, and moments later, the train pulled away. Whimsy stood alone as the platform emptied of sound. Back at Ainsworth Hall, he gathered the household in the drawing room one final time. Penlow had recanted under pressure, and Beatrice had been quietly cleared. The press would be fed a palatable version, a tragic inheritance dispute gone wrong, a servant caught in the crossfire, the heir's unfortunate demise. Beatrice approached him before he left. "You were right," she said. "It wasn't finished, no," he replied, "but it is now." And then, just as he stepped out into the gravel drive, a servant ran to him, breathless. "Sir, telegram from Rome. It's about Charles." Whimsy took the note, read it once, then twice. "Charles Ainsworth dead. Found poisoned in his apartment. No signs of forced entry." A single note on the table. "For Gregory." Whimsy folded the telegram slowly. The weight of the case settled in his chest once more, not as a burden, but as a final, heavy truth. Justice had been served, or perhaps it had merely served itself. The fire had burned low in the hearth of Ainsworth Hall, casting flickering shadows on the library walls as Lord Peter Whimsy stood alone, staring into the fading embers. The telegram lay folded in his coat pocket like a forgotten secret. Charles Ainsworth dead by poison, just as Gregory had been. No sign of struggle, no prints, no witness, just the note. For Gregory, a perfect mirror to perfect. Whimsy didn't move for some time, letting the silence draw out as the house settled into uneasy stillness. He had wrapped the case, or so everyone believed. Beatrice had returned to the chapel to pray. Penlow had gone back to the village, nursing his bruised pride. The newspapers had already spun a polished version of the truth. But something needled at him, quiet and persistent, like a grain of sand in the soul. He turned slowly and glanced toward the glass cabinet in the far corner. Inside, the silver fox mask still hung from its ribbon, catching the last of the firelight. An ornament, they'd all said. Harmless, decorative. But in Gregory's letters, there had been a line that still rang hollow. Even now, I wonder if I ever knew her face. At the time, whimsy had taken it to mean Beatrice, or perhaps Margarethe. But what if Gregory's lament hadn't been about love at all? What if it had been literal? He retrieved the mask from its case and examined it under the lamplight. Delicate craftsmanship. Italian, most likely. Faint smudges on the inner lining, almost invisible. He'd seen it before. Worn at a party years ago, one of those curated gatherings at the old Ainsworth estate before Gregory's exile, and if memory served, it had belonged not to Margarethe nor Beatrice, but to their mother, Lady Ainsworth. Dead these past 5 years, or so the records claimed. That the idea was absurd. He dismissed it almost at once, and yet something about the mask tugged him toward the desk. He opened the drawer and drew out the guest list from the infamous masquerade that had taken place days before Gregory's return. His finger traced names most he recognized, but one stood out. M. de Civo, Italian aristocratic, a name that had appeared nowhere in the investigation, no interview, no statement. And the signature in the guest book ornate, precise, but not quite consistent with the fluid, airy script of Margarethe's known handwriting. A forgery, an alias? He laid the mask beside it and paused. What if someone else had been behind both murders? Not Margarethe, not Charles, but someone moving silently behind them, feeding them fear and motive. Someone with a deeper wound to avenge. He thought of Lady Ainsworth's long illness, the whispers of cruelty from her husband, and Gregory's cold ascension in the family. The dowager had been beloved by some, but others, especially Gregory, had treated her as a fading fixture, inconvenient, and expensive. What if she hadn't died of illness? What if her departure had simply marked the beginning? A quiet knock came at the door. It was Bunter, ever precise. "Shall I prepare your bags, my lord?" "Soon," Bunter, whimsy murmured. But not just yet. He held the mask in his hand again and stared at it not as a relic, but as a puzzle piece, oddly shaped and slightly out of place. There was something here, something unfinished. "Before we leave," he said, "I want to speak to the groundskeeper." Bunter's brow arched, barely perceptible. "May I ask why?" "Because someone was buried 5 years ago, and I'd like to be quite sure it was the right someone." Outside, the frost had begun to cling to the hedges again. Winter wasn't finished with Kent, and neither was the truth. Whimsy walked slowly toward the rear of the estate, where the family plot lay beneath a copse of old yews. He passed the row of stones until he reached the one marked Catherine Ainsworth, 1869 to 1920. The soil was undisturbed, but Whimsy stared at it with growing suspicion. The funeral had been private, the coffin sealed, no photographs of the body, and Margarethe had only arrived after the burial. All of it might have been by design. He knelt, tracing the stone. "Murder," he whispered to the grave, "is never the first lie, just the loudest." Behind him, the wind picked up soft, steady, and strangely warm for this late hour. It stirred the leaves in a hush, almost like a whisper, and as Whimsy rose to his feet, he saw something glinting at the base of the yew, a silver pin, shaped like a fox, half buried in the roots, the same sigil from the mask's ribbon, not dropped. Recently, not forgotten, deliberately placed. He pocketed it and turned back toward the house, his thoughts already leaping ahead. He would return to London, certainly, but not to rest. There were archives to search, letters to track, shipping manifests to cross-check. If Lady Catherine had survived, someone had helped her vanish. If she hadn't, someone had worn her mask to deadly effect. Either way, the case was no longer closed. And Lord Peter Whimsy had never liked loose ends.